no, don't worry.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for hanging in there with us. We really appreciate it, and I'm so happy to see you all here today. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Paget Skogman. She is an Iowa-based pediatrician at Mercy Medical Center, and she works statewide and nationally through the American Academy of Pediatrics, supporting children's health and healthy tech habits. And I'm so glad she's with us today, and I'm going to let her just take it off. So thanks, Paget. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Heidi. And thank you so much for this opportunity. And thank you to all of you for the work that you do. I, as a pediatrician, firmly believe that children are our future. And sometimes in the United States, it feels like, especially with policy and like capitalism and decisions that we make, children are undervalued. And I really just love advocating for them. And I'm sure all of you do as well because of your job. And I think your job is much harder than mine, probably, because disciplining a group of 200 K through 8 sounds not like my cup of tea. So thank you for all of that. I got into this topic, and I always talk about this very randomly. Kind of, I read The Anxious Generation back in 2024, and I worked as a general pediatrician for about 5 years in clinic. And throughout my time seeing probably over 75,000 office visits, there was kind of this undercurrent of like, something, this does not feel like childhood is going super well. Like, what is happening, kind of? And then as I read The Anxious Generation and put some of it together, I was like, oh, screens and digital media are having more of an impact than I realized, and more of an impact than most of us realized. And so, in no way, shape, or form does that mean that I think there's any shame about using screens or utilizing them. This is much more just becoming aware of the effect that they have on children's development and brain, our own brain. And then I encourage families to mindfully choose when you use your digital media, because obviously it's 2026, we're moving into the world of AI. All of us have to have a smartphone and screens, but we want to make it a tool that we're utilizing, not a tool that's using us. So it's with that that I will start this presentation, and always send questions. And Hyder and Adriana are just going to interrupt me. I love in-person interaction because I feed a lot off of the energy of other people. So speaking just to my laptop is a little bit tricky for me. But let me know if you need anything. First things first, I have no financial disclosures. I'm not paid to do this. I don't get any money from it. I'm also not representing any medical organization. I do this all kind of on my own time. This is not part of Mercy or anywhere else that I am affiliated with. Just a passionate mom and pediatrician. I'm also educating about research that I have not personally conducted. So I have done a fair amount of research in pediatric obesity, but I today am mostly reading and redistributing what other researchers have done. And I'm honestly just a concerned mom. Like, it sounds like many of you are also parents. Some of you have older children, and therefore, honestly, I would love to hear your perspective on all of these, because you have kind of lived through the past 10 years of kind of this uncontrolled experiment that we've been in. But I'm just learning, gathering information, staying curious, and pivoting as I go. So, with that, I have a presentation challenge. So, if you're in your office or whatever, I would request that you take your phone and put it in a drawer or a bag. Shut it off, silence it, do whatever you have to do. Now, with that request, does it evoke any emotions for you, right? Are you like, no, I need to be scrolling and doing things on my phone while I'm doing this? Are you even able to put it away because of your job, different things like that? But if you do or are able to put it away, then keep a tally just for yourself. We won't have to like share this or anything, but for the number of times over the next hour that you are encouraged or inspired to pick it back up. Because I think our phones are kind of powerful and have a little bit of a pull on us that even I didn't really realize until I started becoming aware of it. So the purpose of that is only to increase your awareness of how the phone affects you in life. The first part that I really want to discuss with kiddos today is the brain. This is the human brain. It is fascinating and amazing. When you're born at birth, your adult brain or your child brain weighs about 26% of your adult weight. By the age of 5, your brain has grown so rapidly that it weighs approximately 88% of your adult weight. So that to say, the ages 0 to 5 are a very critical period of development. Also critical, which we're not addressing today, happens to be perinatal development, because actually the most rapid period of brain development and growth is when the babies are in utero. And that's when they are very sensitive to maternal stress, maternal medications, toxin exposure, different things like that, which we're obviously not covering for the purpose of today. But just so you know, some of the groundwork of what these kids are dealing with has already been laid before they're born. But what we do know is that the brain itself is very plastic and evolves a lot as we go through development. This shows, as an example, a couple different areas of the brain that I will discuss. If you can see my mouse, the frontal lobe is the slowest to develop. That is the one that's impacted by ADHD. And also, it controls kind of our impulsivity, our good logical reasoning and develop, and isn't fully developed until you're 25, actually. Inside, if it were cut open, kind of is the nucleus accumbens, which is where we'll discuss a lot of kind of dopamine's effects. Nucleus accumbens is developed a little bit earlier on and kind of the reward pleasure center. So that is what, if something tastes good, that lights up. If something feels good, that lights up. And as humans have evolved, it's very helpful because that is what keeps us fed, procreating, and alive. So obviously, we all respond to feeling pleasure in certain circumstances. And so that's actually a survival mechanism that we have that. Then we have touch, sight. Your cerebellum is all about balancing coordination, and your temporal lobe is where hearing, language, and memory come from. Your brainstem is kind of what we always refer to as your reptilian brain. So the brainstem is the one that like keeps you breathing, your heart beating, and does kind of all the involuntary movements, which is where you can have a brain injury and still be left able to like breathe on your own, but not have much other function or speaking ability. This is a graph that shows kind of neuron development. And so, what we know from here, this is kind of before birth. Birth happens around here. And then this is showing kind of the curves of as they develop. So you can see kind of your visual cortex and auditory cortex develop most heavily the first 5 years of life. And then your Broca's, which is kind of your speaking like development and things, occurs a lot longer, closer to like 10 to 11. And then prefrontal cortex is much longer. This is landing closer to 25. We know that with certain neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD or autism, or if the baby has had an in utero exposure to something, these can vary. So the rates of these kind of developing can vary. What we know best from studies most recently is that the prefrontal cortex with ADHD is significantly delayed. So that one is kind of like about kind of a 2 to 3 year later development, which means that those kids will develop the ability eventually to respond and regulate their impulses. They just might not be at the expected kind of first, second, third grade level, if that makes sense. And then myelination is this process that's occurring kind of all throughout development, even into an adulthood. And that is where we're adding fat wrapping the neurons. And so that's where good, nutritious food, there's a lot of fat in formula and breast milk, because this process is very crucial to baby's brain development, but kids as well, right? So fat's a very important part of their life. And then what we know, and I don't think, yeah, this slide accidentally got added onto the other. So you'll see kind of, it's a lot of words, but basically, I'll go back and just talk about this one. There are two different ways that the brain develops. So the first is an experience dependent development, and that's kind of time sensitive. So that's in the first 0 to 5 years of life, where babies have to have touch, sight, language, their smell, visual. So, like, all of these things affect how their brain is formed and developed. And so, what we've seen in different studies are, as an example, in like Romanian orphanages, where children were not held between the ages of 0 to 5, their brain actually loses the ability to form some of those synapses and is never able to fully recover from that. So the first type of experiences are kind of 0 to 5, and they have to happen. where that plays in with screens, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, is that parents are utilizing screens more. And what we know is that iPads and television are not the same type of language that kids need to hear from like reading a book or having a conversation. Similarly, some of the sensory experiences, right? Being held when you cry or picked up when you look distressed or things like that. We're starting to see that some parents, especially if they have their own digital addiction, are missing those cues for their kids. And so what's happening then is that the brain is not able to develop in an optimal environment, kind of in that 0 to 5. And then all of you that are running kind of these after school programs, I'm sure you have seen and cared for children that it just seems like no matter what you do, you can't handle, not handle, I don't want to say that in the right way. Some of their emotional regulation and ability to adapt to the world is a little bit altered. And we are starting to see in research that that can be from parental attachment related to some of parents' issues with screens at these young ages. So, for what that's worth, the second type of brain development can happen from 0 to 5, but also all throughout life. And so that's experience dependent development of your brain and neurons, where anytime any of you go to learn something new, whether that's playing the piano, or you deep dive into poetry, or you decide to become a public speaker, or you want to learn to shoot a gun at the range, you then change the plasticity of your brain, right? And change the patterns in which those neurons fire, and then develop different better development of certain areas, kind of. And so that's where each of us, then as we go throughout life, our experiences shape the plasticity of our brain and how it looks and alters, right? Which is as you get older, then everyone's brain differs a little bit more. Whereas we think, at least from the ages of 0 to 5, they should be a little bit more similar. The other downfall to that is that these experiences, right, while they can be very enriching and very positive in terms of the neuroplastic development, also can be harmful. So this is a lot of where, and I'm part of the ACE coalition, the adverse childhood events, right? But these traumas that kids experience, whether it's parental addiction or neglect or abuse or, whatever kind of emotional, mental, or physical trauma they can encounter, does alter their brain's wiring, sometimes for life. And that's where, thankfully, the brain is plastic. So you can obviously do, EMDR or cognitive behavioral therapy or things later in life to help remodel some of that wiring. But that's where some of these critical years are so crucial. And I say that obviously you all are more in the after school, so you're past the age of 5. But I think what we're experiencing and what I feel like I'm seeing as a pediatrician is that some of this foundation is laid at such a young age that I think we need to keep educating parents and families more and more and more so that hopefully we can support those families and better educate them to lay a little bit stronger of a foundation if we can. Um, so this is you know what, guys? Hold on one sec. I opened the wrong PowerPoint. Can I, Heidi, can I back out of this?
Yes, of course.
Okay, because I'm like, I made a bunch of changes to these slides, and then I'm like, I
That's
don't have
okay.
them. They're not on these slides. Uh, let
You're
me
fine.
grab this one. Yep, here we go. All right, team. We're gonna try to see if I can switch this. And if I can't, then in the meantime, if you have any questions,
Just hit
feedback at the
slideshow again and
moment.
you should be good.
But do I stop share, then
Nope.
reshare?
Nope.
No. So just
You're good. Just hit slideshow up at the top of your PowerPoint.
of this one.
Yep. There you go.
Is it
Perfect.
doing it?
Yep.
Is it the your work matters with the guy pointing?
That's right. Looks great.
Oh, great. Okay. So this is where all these slides, like I look at all these other words that I'm like now making up because I didn't have on my slides. Anyway, uh your I can't emphasize enough how crucial I think the work of after school programs, teachers, daycare providers are in the future of our world, right? So as I'm explaining kind of all this brain plasticity, you think about in our current society where most families have to work two jobs and these kids go to daycare, our daycare providers are helping set some of the foundation for the future of these kids. And so I I personally place a ton of weight on what you do and think we very much like underpay everyone that cares for children because I think it's so crucial. I also think and hope that throughout this presentation, you'll be inspired to see like all the little ways that you are already making a difference and can continue to do so with these kids. So that's like really cool for me. So this is where this is then pivoting a little bit. This is another aspect of brain development, but it's more the theories of psychosocial development, right? Which is kind of your ego, but then how you show up in the world. And so I want to focus a little bit on these because each of these is being dramatically impacted by screens. And that's where I think also we're starting to see some of our behavioral anxiety, depression sorts of issues, if that makes sense. So, infant to 18 months is, and I placed this picture of the baby down here kind of crying with the phone, but that's where babies are learning to develop a sense of trust. And that's that I trust that if I have a need, it will be met by whoever's caring for me. And then 18 to 3 months, they're trying to develop this ability to like, can I be a little bit more independent or feel shame and doubt if I'm unable to do things. And then where you guys are starting to see is kind of around this like 3 to 5, as well as 5 to 13. But they're trying to see, can I do good in the world and get feedback from it, right? And especially in that elementary age, as you're seeing kind of those 5 to 13-year-olds, they're trying to decide like am I good enough? Can I add value, right? Like am I able to perform the task at school and feel a sense of pride from that, right? Which is where I also think some of these kids are a little bit set up for difficulty with that because if you haven't had great reading and like hands-on activity as a younger child, we know for a fact there are studies that show that if you're practicing reading or stacking blocks or different things like that on a screen in a 2D setting, that doesn't correlate with real life. And so, what kids really need to be doing is doing things in real life that builds their skills and competence. So then they're able to go into a school setting, successfully do some of these things that teachers and after school program coordinators are asking them to do, and then feel a sense of like pride with that. Like, yes, I am a good student, I am a good kid, and I can do this. And then where we get into a lot of the anxiety and depression, right? So we're seeing that kind of at a younger age because of a little bit of this. And then 13 to 21 is where I think social media has made a huge impact. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But this 13 to 21 for the identity versus confusion and fidelity, basically you're trying to answer the question during that development, who am I in the world? Right? Who am I? What do I stand for? What do I believe in? What are my values? How do I fit into the world as I am? And so I think about my own development, right? Growing up on a farm in Northwest Iowa, I was Paget Smith. I believed in kind of these things, right? And that period of life is very hard and confusing for all humans. That's supposed to be lots of questioning, lots of comparing. Where we see, I think, social media playing a huge factor in this is that not only are these kids comparing themselves to other peers at school, but now they have this online influence and they're seeing millions of things from social media, tons of images about what their body should look like, what type of makeup they should wear, how fit they should be, how muscular they should be, what they should be, all these different comparison things. And I think it makes it harder for children to discern who am I and what do I believe in, right? And you could even kind of, no study has been done with this too, but I wonder, I don't know this for a fact, right? But like we have so many more transgender queries. Not that that's a bad thing. I support any and all questioning kind of, but I'll often see kids in clinic that will say, yeah, I don't know. I might be bi, I might be gay, I'm not sure. Like I can't really tell, or they'll come in and they'll have identified as a he versus a she. And then, oh, but that was kind of last year. I was a little bit confused. And one of my friends was dabbling in it and I was looking online and then there were all these other things, so like, and I'm like, I get it. I mean, I remember there was a period of time in my life I hadn't had like a boyfriend ever, until like medical school, which is probably too much information for all of you. But then it was like, am I lesbian? Like, I don't think I like girls, but I don't know, kind of. Whereas I think if it's easier to get quiet and like listen to your own heart and voice and soul, you may be transgender, you may be lesbian, but that is coming from you, not from everything you're seeing on the internet, which is tricky. So with that, getting into screens, when we're looking at current state of children, these are national data averages, and this is actually from about 3 years ago, I believe. So kids, according to the AP, are really not supposed to have any screen time less than the age of 2, with the exception of video FaceTiming, because we think that like talking to grandparents in a screen way has a lot of benefit. But 6-month-olds are getting 1 hour a day. 24-month-olds, 2.5 hours a day, ages 8 to 10, 6 hours a day, 11 to 14, 9 hours a day. And then we actually see it go back down a little bit. This is kind of when they're in the peak of that, like, who am I in the world phase. And then 15 to 18, often they start to get a little bit more secure in that. And that's starting to go back down 7.5 hours a day. We're also looking at here's back in 19 kind of 75 hours of day that kids spent doing certain activities. And so what we're seeing is that there's significantly less outdoor play as well as like socializing outside of the home. So running around in the neighborhood, getting in all sorts of trouble with your friends, just random unstructured play, and much more screen-based activities, sport, and homework. And so the only piece of that to kind of think of and consider is that when everything is adult led, we wonder or hypothesize that then children are a little bit less of taking an initiative to problem solve some of their own things, a little bit less creative, right? Coming up with their own solutions and games. We also think that there's real benefit in kids themselves, like working things out and figuring that out without necessarily an adult able to supervise. And so with my own kids, I know we definitely probably like follow this trend of where the things are. But I am trying on the daily to like back myself out of their situation and let them do a little bit more of it, which is hard. And I think my neighbors probably think I'm like a crazy mom because I'm letting my kids run all over our neighborhood. So, we'll see. This is from the new, this is also though, okay, the purpose of this is that this is not just a parenting problem, right? So I think initially, at least I, as a parent, was like, oh my gosh, I'm learning all this about screens, and my kids are doing this, and they're doing this, and they're doing this. And like, like this is my fault, right? Um, I don't actually think it's any one parent's fault, right? We do have to take accountability once we know, but so much of this, and especially for those of you that mentioned that you have older children, smartphones became ubiquitous in 2012, right? So yes, it's 2026, but that's only 14 years. And we had almost zero data on the smartphone's effects on brains, development, mental health. We had none of that until about 2022, right? That's when everything started. We were like, oh my gosh, look at in these last 10 years, what has happened with anxiety, what's happened with depression, what's happened with socialization outside the home, all these different things. So the American Academy of Pediatrics, which I'm a member of, is starting to recognize this and has proposed this is their model of a digital ecosystem that they just sent out in their recent policy that was published this year. So, with that, it's kind of recognizing that for all of us, each child is different, each family is different, and you're very much working with all of the influences that are happening outside of you. So, as an example of that, like in my household, we don't watch YouTube or iPads, right? And I, as a parent, try to not do that as well, especially in front of my kids. But then when my daughter goes to school, she's around her other friends, and this is all kind of new information, right? And so they're watching YouTube sometimes during their brain breaks. Her friends are buying like lip plumping gloss from Ulta because that's what this beauty influencer that they're following has kind of seen. And then they're all kind of talking about that, so all of a sudden she's this like fourth grader that has no interest in makeup or boys or any of it, but is influenced by her friends who have been influenced by their own views and kind of what's around in the world, right? So you're influenced by all of it, and that's where we can't as parents put so much pressure on ourselves, but then also just continue to like educate, talk about it. When we learn a little bit better, then we do a little bit better. If that makes sense. And some of this also, I really think has to come from legislation and lawmakers and policy, right? Because what's happening right now is that Facebook and TikTok and Instagram and different things like that are so profitable. They are so profitable and they're not going to go away, right? But I think as a society, hopefully we'll start to recognize what impact this has on kids and set some laws or rules so that they're not allowed to market whenever they want, send out whatever commercials they want. You know what I mean? Like to kind of like just be profiting off of our families and kids and things like that. Because that is a big piece of it. So, for what that's worth, that's kind of what the digital ecosystem is starting to show and model in our society. And part of why this presentation is so awesome, the opportunity to talk to all the after school providers, because how great if all of you know a little bit more and then maybe are able to, point the kids a little bit away, use a little bit less iPads at your after school program, or use a little bit less TV, or recognize that when some of these kids are having real externalizing behaviors of impulsivity and rage, they might be watching 6 hours of violent video games at home and that's impacting them, So it could be a point of discussion for with their parents, like, hey, how much screen time are they on? We just learned that this does impact kids' behavior kind of all day long. Maybe you let them play outside more. I have no idea, right? Like, don't overstep your bounds, but that's kind of where this is cool. Um, so initially, the book Anxious Generation, that I'll talk a lot about, really focused on smartphones and teenagers. And yes, we know that that is a problem, but I think what the AAP is seeing with the digital ecosystem, what I am seeing with my kids, is that it does start earlier than we think, right? And so I put on here kind of this picture of this family not necessarily paying attention to their kid, which I am so guilty of. I have to set such specific boundaries with where I put my phone and what times I use it because otherwise I'm half-ass parenting, for lack of a better word. And also what I was mentioning with other kids at school, right? So like my kids are influenced by the amount of screen time that their other kids are getting at school. And so we have to kind of all communicate about that and just become a little bit more aware of it. Not that we can immediately change it, but I think the more we're aware and like talking about it, then we can kind of decide when we use the screen time and the impact it has on our own individual kid. Um, this is a recent study just published in May of 2025, and it kind of goes into a little bit of what I've been alluding a lot, but like the chicken or the egg problem. So we officially know that the more children, and this is at any age, kind of from like two up, are engaged with electronic screens, and that can be TVs, technically movies, YouTube shorts, all the versions of screen, kind of, the more likely they are to develop social emotional problems later in life. And some of that can start at an early age, both internalizing problems such as anxiety and depression and externalizing problems, aggression and hyperactivity. And some of that relates right back down to what we saw about the brain development because we're learning that screens are impacting how different areas of these brain lobes develop. And so kids that use more than 2 hours of screen time a day have a thinner like cortex layer and they have a larger amygdala and a smaller prefrontal cortex. And so we're like, oh, this makes sense that if they're watching a lot of TV, then they're more likely to be angry and impulsive later in the day. We're also seeing then though because of the anger and impulsivity, or maybe they're anxious or depressed or whatever issue they're having, then they're more likely to use screens as a coping mechanism. And as a parent, I don't blame any parent that, gives the kid an iPad. They're silent, they're quiet, they're listening to it, right? You take it away, then all of a sudden they're like raging little monsters because their dopamine just dropped and they have no idea to like how to reacclimate to the real world. And so then what do you want to do as a parent? You want to give them back the iPad. So they're a little bit quieter and they will sit there and not scream, right? And so this is some of what like my husband and I have learned about screens in our kids. It's actually like if we choose to let them watch TV in the morning, when we shut it off, they're a little bit harder to deal with than on the mornings that we just say, no TV, we just want you to play or whatever, because they never have that kind of quick drop in dopamine related to the screens. So definitely kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? And where education, knowing early is helpful. This gets into the specific kind of pleasure reward cycle for screens and what makes them, it's especially the smartphone in this case and the short apps. So like scrolling Instagram reels or TikToks or YouTube shorts where like you're getting a very quick burst of whatever they're throwing at you and then you're deciding like within 3 seconds like do I want to stay and watch or do I not? Right? And then you like let go or do whatever. So you kind of engage in screen time. Worse if it's this fast-paced, quick scrolling, you can change it whenever you want versus watching a 2-hour movie with your family. Dopamine is released from the nucleus accumbens in your brain down here. That is especially elevated with those frequent unpredictable rewards, kind of mimicking gambling. That makes sense. Dopamine rush is then reinforced, so you do it again and again and again and keep seeking out the screen time. With that, you can become desensitized, which means that your baseline levels of dopamine are now elevated. And then when you take it away, it's really hard to find actual exciting stimulus in life. So you take these kids that are used to like being on an iPad all day and getting like immediate rewards and things popping up in their face, and then you ask them to read a book. And they're like, you want me to watch what? Or like a caterpillar, right? So some of these kids really struggle to sit down and do a lot of things, pen to paper, especially reading. And so then when they become desensitized, they're kind of like overstimulated from it. Then they get anxiety when the screen's not available. So you try to like take it away, and that's where you'll see kids having like rage and kind of wanting to like lash out and do a variety of other things because they know they need that screen time to feel good because of their dopamine levels. And then especially as kids are going through adolescence, they're very vulnerable to this because of specifically the neuroplasticity in their brain, the way they're trying to figure out who they are in the world. They want to feel good about themselves, different things like that. So that's where we can really get in a tricky cycle with some of these kids. And this honestly, we're starting to recognize happens in adults as well. So we're just as vulnerable as some of these kids with the exception that we have had time to think and develop and evolve, which is really great. So our brains are a little bit more steady and sturdy than theirs are. Um, this goes into, I love this slide because I'm like, you know what? This is not just a United States problem. This is actually all over the world. So this is looking at the amount of screen time for teenagers 13 to 18. This was a study from, they surveyed from 2020 to 2023, and then looked at, I mean, look at some of these in South Africa, average screen time 9 hours and 37 minutes for kids. Russia was 8 hours and 38 minutes. US is like number kind of 10 or 11, and we're right around that 7 hour mark. You can see then the changes from 2019 to 2021. So 2019 had less kind of overall, and then we're starting to see more increases, the 4 hour mark, and then the more than 8 hours. And a lot of that is, again, relating back to the digital ecosystem. Shorts on TikTok and YouTube and things like that have blown up in the last 5 years. So the types of content that children and adults are consuming is changing. And that is impacting that dopamine cycle and then also how drawn we are to it. This I have emphasized several times, but this is probably one of the most important story, like take home points from this entire presentation. Not all screens are equal, right? And so I'm not a proponent of no screens ever, right? Because that's not realistic. That's not 2026. But we know, as a matter of fact, that content does matter, right? So I put on here Mr. Rogers. I don't know if any of you have like looked at any of his old episodes that are available online, but if you watch them, they're slow, steady, methodical. They follow the same rhythm every time, and they always like teach a moral lesson. And I grew up and love and adore Mr. Rogers, right? Versus the top 10 YouTube channels for kids. Even when I was doing this presentation, when you look at some of these, like this is down here, the Cosmic Kids Yoga lady, and she's great. I have used her for my kids, but when you watch the screen, it's so much visual input. Like she is constantly changing the backgrounds and what different things are happening versus like a mom doing yoga on a white screen. And so for my kids, I've gone away from even using things like that because I know because of the brain chemistry, again, they're getting more dopamine from that than they really need. And I'd rather them have something like slow and steady and a little bit educational. I also think there's huge benefit to like having shared screen time with your kids. So sitting down and watching a show together or sitting and watching a movie together where you're discussing it and you're talking about what you're seeing, right? Because that makes it an educational experience for them. Versus when they're just like sitting on the couch. Anything that involves like scrolling where they can change it, I really caution parents to utilize as little of that as you can. And again, that's some of just their attention span and the rewiring of the brain. And then a little side note down here, because I study and work with pediatric obesity, we know as a matter of fact that obesity does correlate with screen time. Interestingly, though, and this kind of goes back to the brain science, it's not that these kids are sitting more than other kids, they actually are just as active. It's not also that they're consuming food while they're watching the screen or playing a video game. It's actually because we think of the dopamine drop, they eat more sweet and salty snacks after being on a screen because of the impact on their brain. So you kind of like you crash, you crashing, you don't feel good, and then you want a snack and kind of go out for that. So really interesting, I think, because that was not at all the hypothesis that I would have predicted for that issue. And obviously, childhood obesity and metabolic health is just a huge focus of mine because that predicts so much of health later in life. Um, so these are the two books that I'll talk about next for the couple slides. Both were written recently. Jean Twenge is 2017. Her book is amazing. It's iGen. Not as good of a story though as Anxious Generation, which is a lot longer but has really interesting data and kind of is how I got involved in all of this because he started to look at the data of smartphones and mental health. This is a chart from Jonathan Haidt that shows kind of 2018 to 2022. This gray bar is when most Americans started to get smartphones. So 2012 is kind of, if we draw the line up here, when they became ubiquitous. Interestingly, that's the year that both myself and my husband got our first iPhone. And then what we watch with that is, and this is all from a national survey. So some of it is self-reported, some of it is actually medically diagnosed, but percentage of anxiety prevalence. And so what we see is that these 18 to 25-year-olds, so these are a lot of your children that kind of grew up in this, like we all just got our first smartphone right around their younger age, and then we're going into it, their anxiety is fourfold what it was prior to the smartphone. But these, then we even see there's some effect on our 26 to 34. So this is like older, this is Gen Z population kind of here. This is millennial, some of this is millennial. And then really our boomers down here are the only generation that has not been affected and more anxious because of smartphones. And I would say I fall into this category, which is definitely also more anxious than we were prior to smartphones. And I feel this sometimes as a mom because there's so much information available to us at all times, and it feels like it increases the amount I compare my parenting with these other versions online. And then I feel kind of anxious about like, am I doing enough? Am I doing the right thing? Why is this person doing this? Should I be doing this? They're eating this. What about that? Whereas like back when I grew up, 1990, if my mom had a question about like what to feed her kids, she would have asked her mom. She would have maybe read a book. She could have talked to a couple of her friends, right? But she wasn't inundated with this like eat smart food app and this what this dietitian is saying and what this PhD is saying and what these other people. So I think as a parent, it is a very real thing that this does increase anxiety. And we see a lot of this in our clinics, talking to these parents, trying to figure out like, how do I feel like a good parent and be a good parent in 2026? Major depressive episodes. So with anxiety, always correlates depression because you tend to run anxious long, then get depressed. Um, we have seen huge increases in girls, especially, but also in boys. So even though the boys are a lot lower, they are about double, and the girls are kind of fourfold. And again, this is kind of right about when the smartphone became ubiquitous. Emergency department visits. So these are for kind of people like me that are a little bit skeptical and kind of like, well, yeah, but how much of this is overreported, or all these teens are so angsty because they're all aware and it's like the cool fad to be, depressed or anxious because of what you're seeing on your social media. So emergency department visits are pretty legit from what I've seen, and we have had a massive uptick in these. This also kind of bugs me. This is females 15 to 19, but also these are 10 to 14-year-olds. So look at this. It was so low and now it's so high. And I would say that like I do feel like my 10-year-old's childhood is being influenced by what's out on YouTube, even though she's not on it. This goes into, I happen to be a pediatric hospitalist, so I care for children now that are hospitalized, and we won't hospitalize anyone that doesn't need it. And so you can see then from 2012 kind of what hospitalization rates in girls have done. This has plateaued a little bit because this data ended kind of in 2022. So it's not necessarily continuing to skyrocket, but it's pretty high. And this I wanted to point out for the gentlemen. So boys tend to be less affected by social comparison than females. So we think that they're a little bit protected from some of the social media harms. However, their depression rates from this screen are higher. And what's really sad is that their successful suicide attempts are much higher. So we're looking at this was kind of back in 2010, and boys are always more likely to successfully complete a suicide attempt than girls are. But they have a 91% increase and girls is 167. So it's just like, ugh, we just want to help these kiddos be as strong and resilient as they can be. This I thought was really interesting. Jonathan has this in his book, but it talks about how activities of kids have changed. And I'm sure all of you have felt this as parents, like, especially with some of your teenage kids. And it's not ubiquitous across all kids, but it's not uncommon for me to go into a 16-year-old well child check and be like, oh my gosh, do you have your driver's license? Are you so excited, right? Because I was like jacked to be able to drive around and like do things on my own as a kid. And I can't even tell you the number of times kids will be like, "Yeah, I don't even have my driver's permit yet." And I'm like, "Really? Like you don't want to drive?" And they're like, "No, I don't really need to go anywhere." Right? Because like so much of the world lives on their phone or their TV or whatever. And so I just think that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure if that's good or bad, right? Because obviously teenage drivers are risky. So if there's less of them, maybe that's in safety wise a good thing. But I just wonder about their ability to like be confident and go out and explore the world by themselves. So they're having less sex, which is a good thing, I would think. But less alcohol, also less driver's license, and less jobs, lots less employment than what we're seeing. This is kind of back in the 80s, and then it's really dropped off these last couple of years. This gets into a where does all this data, right, as I'm presenting things come from? So this is a really cool study of 12,000 kids that they started. It's almost now 10 years old, but open enrolling them ages 9 to 10, studying images of the brain and gathering data about food, exercise, sleep, diet, their body mass, their blood pressure, all these things. And so what I love about this is that every time I do this study, these are literally all the papers that I read in preparation for this presentation before since the last time I gave it, which was just a couple, so maybe it's been 6 weeks ago. But like the rate of knowledge that we're obtaining with regards to screens and development is exponential at this point. And so I'm hopeful then what we'll see over the next, 1 to 4, 5 years is that parents, educators, people like you guys that are caring for kids become much more aware of screens' impact on their brain development, on their emotional health, on their mental health, on their physical health, and then we utilize them more mindfully. So we're just aware of when we want to use them or not. So wrapping up and getting into then what can we do? Because obviously I am not trying to paint a super dismal picture. I still think kids are amazing and resilient and are going to be able to thrive, but I think we're at a great spot of being able to pivot and do some things a little bit differently. And I should have changed this to 2026 because it is now 2026. So this gets into the digital ecosystem. So I think in this, where we start, right, is education and awareness, knowing your child, knowing yourself, talking to your schools, talking to your educators. Hey, should we use iPads in the classroom as much as we are? Should we be having, our kids use screen time when they're over for play dates? Should we be letting them play outside more? Should we, kind of whatever that is for you? Because ultimately, even as a parent of kids, I'm not able to control this just for my family. Like, I need to kind of influence the community and state around me, which is where I got into this advocacy and kind of talking to individuals in our area. And hopefully, there'll be lots of lawmaking changes. I am actually headed to Washington, D.C. in 3 weeks, I think, to do some advocacy on Capitol Hill, which is pretty cool. And was helping, I actually helped work with Kim Reynolds last year to make some of the smartphone changes that we've seen at high schools, which we're starting to see great impact from. So it's pretty cool what's changing. Jonathan Haidt, the reason I love this book is that he, at the end of it, proposes 4 norms that we all could consider for our kids that could change the culture in the community and the trajectory of how they're interacting with each other. So his proposal and recommendation is no smartphones before 14. And that's mostly because to have the internet and a phone, internet and a camera in your pocket at all times is a pretty big privilege and comes with a lot of responsibility. So, recommending that we delay that a little bit longer. Again, mental, emotional, physical health benefits. No social media before 16. I could not agree more with that. And that is simply because kids need less comparison to help them figure out who they are in the world. They do not need to be socializing on those and getting bazillions of images of what they should be doing because the world is already hard enough. That just makes it harder. I love locking phones during the school day so kids are more focused, more interactive, shooting spitballs, getting in all sorts of trouble, but not silently looking at their phones when they have downtime. And then more free play and responsibility. And so that's kind of what I was describing as a parent, where I'm trying to let my kids play outside a little bit more unsupervised and let them ride their bikes around the neighborhood. And admittedly, when I first read this book a couple years ago and did this, my daughter was 8 at the time. And I was like, yeah, I think I'm comfortable if you ride your bike like in our neighborhood. She goes, oh, Mom, I can't do that. I don't know where I'm going. What if I get lost? What if a stranger tries to abduct me? What if I can't cross the street on my own? I was like, I am raising the anxious generation. And so, with time and some good communication and like education and like letting her explore a little bit more, I do feel like I'm improving some of her confidence in that way. But I only share that story to say there's no shame in whatever style of parenting you're doing because we're all doing our best and learning as we go. This has kind of like ages at which kids get smartphones currently. So our goal kind of at the heart would be that most kids wait until here. And obviously you can see that's when it hits 91% of children get a smartphone. But what we're seeing is like by 12, almost 75% of kids have smartphones. And at 10, almost 50% do, 11, 50% do. So that's where I think if we can shift the curve a little bit this way, then as an individual parent, you won't have as much pressure to get your kid a phone, hopefully, which makes parenting a little bit easier. But then also, you'll change kind of what those kids are doing because the reality is, even if I don't give my 12-year-old a smartphone, if she waits till here, if 71% of her peers have one, then even when they go to the mall or they go out to dinner or whatever, that means that 3/4 of the kids she's with are probably going to be on their phone for part of the meal, which alters her experience as well as all of theirs. So that's where kind of the collective community engagement is really awesome. There is this free is your kid ready for an iPhone through the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's a really quick, like 10 question souvenir. But if you're a parent considering if and when to get a smartphone, it has really great questions to consider asking. And a lot of that gets into how responsible are they? How's their executive function? How's their mental health? To ask you a few questions to discern that. Um, the AAP's approach to all of this is exactly what I've been trying to say all throughout the presentation, but awareness and education is where we're at. So, the first point of this is knowing your own child and their context. So, obviously, as an after school program coordinator, you're not going to be able to dilly down to this level. But if you're a parent, like I am, you might say, oh, one of my kids really is very responsible, doesn't struggle at all with their executive functioning, is very mature, able to regulate, things like that. Like they're not at as high of a risk of getting a phone than your 13-year-old that's maybe already a little bit anxious, struggles with impulsivity, doesn't regulate themselves well, and has trouble with time management, right? So for that 13-year-old, I might actually wait until they're closer to 16. But for my super responsible 14-year-old, they're probably ready to get one. So that's kind of most important. Second is context and crowding out. What and when is the usage? And when you're on your phone, what are you missing? And I think this is really important as a parent to recognize because I think that I can be on my phone and have it not affect my kids. But then sometimes they'll say things to me like, Mom, it feels like you're not here because you're like doing other things. Or like, why don't you pay attention to me? Why aren't you talking to me? Because I'm like partially interrupted by the phone and partially engaged. Content, we hit on that. Not all content is equal. I'm not saying all screens are bad, but think about what you're using and how quick, fast acting it is. Calming. So I'm certain all of you are dealing with some aspect of this at school, but if children are used to getting upset and then getting an iPad to calm them down, that is a red flag. And those kids are going to be your ones that really struggle with some of their interactions with peers, emotional regulation, impulsivity, outbursts, things like that, because they haven't learned the skills like they should have to be able to calm and regulate themselves because they were using the screen instead of that. And again, no shame to those parents because I get it, but they really need some intervention. And then communication. Ultimately, all of us probably forevermore have to be thinking of and aware of what is my screen time? How often am I picking up my phone? What am I using it for? How does it make me feel after I'm done scrolling? Things like that. This was another one from the new digital media policy from the AAP, kind of how to choose high quality content, which I think some makes sense, but the other acronym that I really love is screen out. So if they're having lots of streaks that encourage daily play, you don't really love that. Creepy content, creepy, violent, anything that's discriminatory, which is hard to regulate as a parent, but important to pay attention to what they're consuming rewards. So are they, and I kind of don't love iReady for this, admittedly, but like they kind of do a couple problems, then it's like, oh, yay, now you get to go play a game. And it's like, well, the reward for doing the problem should be that they're like figuring it out and like solving a hard problem. And that gives them a little bit of like a dopamine, like, oh, good job. You're figuring that out. You're getting better. You're getting faster versus like sending them an actual treat as they do it. Is it hard to escape? Is it difficult to transition away from the platform? Do they like constantly find themselves wanting to go back to it? Are you struggling to put it down? That kind of thing. Excessive ads. Don't love those. Kids are very easily influenced by what they see. Nagging, prompting for subscriptions, certain engagement, over the top, where it seems very shocking or challenging. Unwanted contact. So can it allow strangers to message the user? We've seen that with some of the Roblox stuff that had some sexual predators on it for children. And toys. Is it like highlighting them to have potential purchases or play features? So ultimately, in my mind, like I don't think a ton about those individually, but more I'm going with like kind of YouTube is all of that. If they're on, a different show that's like showing them a lot of like breaking off often for ads or different things like that. But I think ultimately like a movie that you have screened or vetted is not going to have any of that. Or if you're watching Daniel Tiger on PBS, it has none of that kind of thing. So just pieces to consider. This is also what are you crowding out or the suggested pie chart of play for kids. And so kids need tons of sleep. They need all their screens out of their room. They need to have their phones, if they own one, plugged into the kitchen, get an old-fashioned alarm clock, kids are losing sleep because of these phones. School should be another huge part of it, and utilization, I think, of screens at school needs to be evaluated by everyone. Then the goal would be friends and family, some homework, some meals, some reading, some movement, and some digital play, right? So it's a little piece of it, but not a huge piece of it. And then look at you crowd what is it crowding out, or consider swapping it out, right? With like instead of staying inside and playing Roblox, can you do a pickup game of basketball? Can you learn to play the piano? Can you play a puzzle or do a chess game with your family or whatever that is? And obviously, like we talked about, some of these things initially are going to be really hard for these kids if they're used to being on their screens a lot. So you have to go kind of slow and steady and try to build good habits. Get them outside, have them read a book, some of that kind of thing that is so beneficial for kids. Um, then this I've alluded to a little bit, but I think across the state, we're starting to see a lot of schools look at implementing a digital literacy curriculum in their school. I personally was an advocate and helped kind of do this for our Cedar Rapids School District. They're hoping to implement one next year. We're doing it at a private school that my kids go to. But this is where essentially, like, we all need to be educated about this. And there's some really great curriculum online that's totally free, has like 12-minute lessons and for every age across the spectrum, so K through 12, I believe they do, that the teachers can implement, right? To teach them a little bit about like, oh, how does my brain feel when I watch this? Or what do I, need to be aware of or things like that. So it's great because kids are so good at learning anything. And so I think if we start to implement a little bit of it in the curriculum, it'll help educate them so they can start to make some of their own good choices too. Then this is kind of just different things I think about as I'm parenting in a world of what's going to be filled with AI. But can your child think creatively? Can they collaborate with others? Can they communicate clearly? And then can they delay gratification for a goal-directed pursuit? And I would argue that a lot of what we discussed with like iPads and quick acting screen time try to steal all of these from your child's development. And then I highlighted this Waldorf School of the Peninsula is like the premier private school in Silicon Valley where all of these smartphones and technology come from. And that school in particular has zero screens. I mean, not even like the fancy whiteboards. They don't do iPads, they don't do computers, they don't do that. None of it K through 8. And then in high school, they teach them how to do a PowerPoint, how to do an Excel spreadsheet, how to code, how to do things like that. But they keep this like very protected area of childhood sacred where they want these kids to learn to problem solve on their own and think outside the box and be an independent individual thinker because that's ultimately what I think is going to really help you stand out in a world of artificial intelligence.
Dr.
Um,
Skogman, we
yeah.
do have some questions.
Oh, good.
Um,
Okay.
we Somebody was wondering what the curriculum was called that you were working on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah, for sure. So this one it's from commonsensemedia.org. And it's easy to access. And it's kind of like this screen down here, but then they have little tiny lessons. There's, I think, 10 per school year, and they're free to any educator. And so they can implement them and they even give like the discussion points to ask with them. So that is what we have utilized at the private school that my kids go to because it was like quick and easy to implement and a way to get the conversation started. The Cedar Rapids
Can
School
you
District,
use it if you're not an educator?
you what?
If
Yeah,
you're
yes.
just
You
like
can
as a
access,
parent?
yes, yes, you can access it even if you're not an educator. So like Common Sense Media is a huge, some of it, I don't love it for all things because some of it they want you to pay for. But some of it is available for free. And so when I logged on, I was able to access all of the school curriculum for free. But then there's some things as a parent, like if you want their reviews for certain things, then they want you to subscribe to their subscription. So I don't do that. I just try to kind of Google my way around it. But it's a think tank in San Francisco. It's a not-for-profit. But literally their whole mission is to create a resource for families and schools to try to help keep kids safe from screen media and education. So yeah. Great question.
Yeah,
I'm
another
almost done too, I think.
question.
Oh yeah, you have more. Okay.
Okay, yeah,
Keep going.
there's two more.
This, I'm gonna highlight this
Um,
one real quick. This is Wait
yeah, go
Until
ahead.
8th. It's a great website, tons of resources, free for everyone. Check that out. It's about delaying the smartphone. And then I think I'm done. So yeah, go for it.
I think I'm trying to understand this question, but it relates back to conversations around 10 to 13-ish where
Yeah.
students or your kids start going out with friends. Um, they want to know, would an older phone that just calls and texts be a better idea versus having absolutely no way to communicate in case of danger? I don't think that's,
Yes,
yeah.
I am a huge fan of, I call them dumb phones or like flip phones. Um, at whatever age, that's very family dependent, right? And so for my kids, like I have only a 10-year-old. And so she has just a normal watch, but she doesn't have any sort of phone communication with me. She has memorized our phone numbers. And so I've tried to instill in her like, you know how to trouble, I trust you. You're very responsible and you can troubleshoot most problems whenever you get into a pinch. If you need to call me, ask an adult for a phone or ask your friend to borrow theirs and you can call, and kind of get a hold of us. So we haven't given her one yet. But my plan is when she gets to a spot where we need to like coordinate with her more back and forth through the day to do a flip phone. And the Wait Until 8th website actually has tons, they like have evaled and reviewed every single type of phone and watch that is available for all kids. And so I think someday when I go to like purchase one, I'll probably use that as my resource to be like, what phone should I be getting her? Or different things like that. I don't do, I'm not a huge fan of watches, the smartwatches where like they can text and call. And mostly that goes back to for me, I don't want to steal her chance to problem solve on her own because I know for a fact if my 10-year-old had a watch, she would text me for the answer for almost anything she encountered. Whereas without it, I think it gives her more of a chance to like troubleshoot on her own, if that makes sense. And I don't want to have to track her. If she is not following the rules and not being responsible, then I will have to track her with like GPS. But otherwise, I'm trying to avoid as much tracking as I can. Because ultimately I want to build that like responsibility and trust.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, I believe it's connected to the type of language you would use. Um, when you're going to give advice on how to implement less screen time, how would you go about explaining that to a 5-year-old versus a 10-year-old, and give us some um, developmental language to explain to them?
Yes. Yes, yes. So Common Sense Media will be a great one for that. Also, the Wait Until 8th has good like verbiage you can include. Different things I do, because obviously we talk about this a little bit with our kids, but like, so for my 5-year-old, I'll say, okay, it's the weekend. I know you want to watch TV. Why don't we pick a movie? I don't want you to watch too much TV because that's like hard on your brain. And I want you to be able to play and do other fun things. And if we're watching TV, then sometimes we miss out on like playing soccer outside. And so I kind of just like propose it that way a little bit. Um, I also have found with my kids having just like good boundaries in place. So what we've landed on currently, which works for our family, is like we don't do any screens during the week, which initially when we switched to that, probably 3 or 4 years ago, that was really hard for them because we were letting them watch like TV in the morning and at night because it was just easier for us. But then I realized like then they're not reading books or like creatively playing. So we kind of talked to them and we're like, hey, as a family, we want to watch a little bit less, TV. We think it's better for your brain. We're still going to do Saturday morning cartoons and a movie, but this is going to be our new change. And it's going to be hard, but here are a couple things we think you could do. And I would say kids are so resilient and like able to adapt that probably the first week or two was hard. Kind of like my husband and I didn't know what to do. And now, I mean, my kids will get up and they're like playing Legos or one of them's reading a book or the other one's, I mean, they like just fill the gap with other things. And then pretty soon they stop asking for the screen as much because they just know that's kind of their norm, which has been great. So, and then as kids get older, I think you have to really get into the weeds of like with my 10-year-old, okay, well, you want to watch YouTube, like let's talk about like how that impacts your brain and like how does it make you feel and what do you really want to watch on there? What do you think it's teaching you? You know, and there are certainly certain times that will like look different things up, or she's got a good argument for like, oh, that is really educational and valid. Like, okay, let's watch it, you know? Because none of this I think is totally black or white, so it has to be really nuanced. And I think it's important to teach your kids that too, right? Like, okay, I love to use my smartphone. Here's things that I think are really good when I use it. Here's not. Or like, you know, I'll sometimes say to them like, "Oh, you guys, I scrolled on my phone last night, like, and then I didn't go to bed till later, and I really feel bad about it this morning." You know, so I'm kind of trying to also show them the humanity of like, I'm learning from this too. That's why I plug it into my bathroom and I try to not touch it after 8 p.m. at night, you know, because I'm just as victim to it as they are. So I don't, that probably like doesn't give you a ton of, but you kind of just have to meet your kid where you're at. And lots of just like little interesting snippets. And with time, I think they pick up on a lot of it. My kids sometimes now roll their eyes when I talk about screens because obviously we're doing a lot of it. So,
I went ahead and shared from that Wait Until Eighth website
yeah,
how to talk to your children about waiting for a smartphone. So there's
perfect.
20 ways in here
Oh, they have
to get some
that
ideas.
website is a plethora of resources. I mean, I every time I go on there, I'm like, wow, this is amazing. Like, so yeah, I highly encourage you if you're getting close to that smartphone discussion, check that out. And then Common Sense Media is great for younger ages because it'll kind of show you like what they teach kindergartners, what they teach first graders, you know, that sort of thing, which is really awesome.
Awesome.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Dr. Skogman. There is
Thanks.
one more question in the chat, but it's really more for
Okay.
us.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
so yes, recording can be made available to you if you're uh, interested in having a link to the recording to share
Yes.
with folks in on your team. You can reach out to myself or Adriana, and we can make sure you get that link. The only difference is if you're watching it, folks that watch it after the live session, um, childcare credit is not available after
Okay.
this live session, but the video will be available. I'm going to put our feedback survey in the chat right now. Oh wow, that address is big. Sorry about that, but hopefully the link will work for you guys.
Heidi, can I
And
say one
once,
more thing?
yes,
Just if
please.
anyone from this has somewhere else you want me to share it, I am always open for that. So please just reach out to Heidi or let me know. I put my contact information there. But my biggest passion is just like educating to start the discussion. Because I think the more we get this out there and talk to families, the better it is. And that's kind of the purpose of all my social media stuff too. So thank you
Fantastic. Yeah, and it looks like on the screen right now you've got all the ways that you could be contacted too, in
so
case
many.
they are interested in reaching out to you personally. But your ticket out of here today is to do the feedback form. Please remember that if you do need credit for today's class, you need to make sure that you do that feedback form and you must put your first and last name in the feedback form so that we can make sure that you receive your credit. We're going to stop the recording now, and we will remain on here for for a few more minutes in case you have additional questions